Hi there, this is Steve Wannall. I'm here to relate another nightmare gig from the world of performance. Now, a lot of the times the gigs I talk about are things that you do as a performer because you simply have to make ends meet. You know, when you're at a stage in your career when a job gets offered and you really can't afford to say no. But, nightmare gigs can come in any sort of form, and oftentimes they happen within something that's an actual rewarding experience. Or at least something that's supposed to be. I'd like to relate a story that happened, my first professional gig right out of college, in fact. Now, I went through college on, let's just say the 6-year plan. I first started in a community college and then transferred to a different institution where nothing from the community college really translated, so I had to start all over again effectively, and I may or may not have changed majors a couple of times. It took me a while to really gel my education, but once I realized I was meant to be a professional actor, things got quite a bit easier for me. And after college, I was so thrilled to be not in school anymore that I took my time, took a cross-country trip. I wasn't really in a huge hurry to jump right into the working world. However, when I got back, and I had absolutely no plan, I got very, very lucky in the sense that I didn't really have time to think about it, because I got called out of the blue by a theater company that I was very well aware of. I knew them. They had a decent reputation in town, but they had gotten my name from someone who I had been to college with, actually, and who had graduated a year before I did and had been working for them for about a year. And they were looking for more people for their touring shows, and as well as one of their new stage shows. And they asked if I would come in for an audition. I was like, oh, great. I didn't even have to look for this myself. I just get called and I can go in for an audition and, awesome. Well, as fate would have it, I got really, really sick just before the audition. It's a long story that maybe I'll relate some other time, but I caught a really nasty, nasty fever from a friend of mine. To give you an idea of how bad this was, my friend actually contracted spinal meningitis and was hospitalized for a couple of days. It did not get that severe with me. I don't really know how this thing works. It may have been something completely unrelated, but I got very, very sick. I was running 104-degree temperature. It was bad. And I had already set up the audition in the middle of all this. And I was not about to pass on it, because this was my first opportunity right out of college. And, out of college, you got an acting degree. You're convinced you're going to become the next big thing, and you're going to get right down to the business of doing it, so you're not going to pass this thing up. But anyhow, I went to the audition. I waited until I was feeling well enough to stand without getting lightheaded. I forced a lot of fluids, and I drove into this place. And, needless to say, the feeling better part didn't really last all that long. I got through an entire evening of auditioning running at least 102-degree fever. And I remember a little bit about the audition. I remember it was fairly long. It wasn't just a come in and, do a monologue and then leave, or, it also wasn't, read a couple of sides and then go. This was a fairly exhaustive process where I auditioned with other actors, and, I was auditioning for 3 or 4 different things all at once. And, several of them were things that people had already done. So they were actors who were already in the tour show, who they were comparing me against. But I really don't remember much of it because I was so sick. And I came home. I spent the next 3 days lying in bed, sweating and feeling awful, and thinking to myself, well, I tanked that. As it turns out, however, I didn't tank the audition. I got cast. In fact, they wanted me for everything. They wanted me for the stage show. They wanted me for the touring shows. I was like, great. This is awesome. I've already got a job. Fantastic. And, in addition to the touring shows, which were, I think we were doing, it was a children's theater. We were doing things like The Frog Prince. We were planning on doing a production of 1,000 Cranes. But the main show that they wanted me for was Winnie the Pooh. Now, this was not the Disney version of Winnie the Pooh. This was a play that was adapted straight from A.A. Milne's original stories. So, there was no Tigger. It was really just kind of the basic Pooh story. The kind of thing where Pooh thinks he sees a heffalump and, Piglet convinces him that the forest is overrun with them and, nobody believes him. But then, it's a lot of mistaken identity. There were some great little children's messages in it, And I was like, hey, I can do this, no problem. Well, I was cast to play both the roles of Christopher Robin and the rabbit. Now I could get away with this because I was a lot younger. I had a lot more hair. I could pass for a little boy at the time. But, the real big part was Rabbit. Everybody was kind of double cast in the show. But to give you an idea of how this worked, generally we would, because it was a touring show, our set consisted of just a pipe and drape backdrop, a big, huge PVC frame, which we had a painted cyclorama on. We had a big wooden tree that was made out of plywood and a stump and a boulder, which were made out of, they were like coffee cans with sandbags in them and paper mache, that kind of thing. It was a very, very low-key set. And the costumes, because we were all playing animals, were mostly just big, heavy suits of fun fur. And because I was double cast, I had these things where, I would go out as one character, say a line, go back, have to do a quick change, come back out as the other character. You know how it goes. Well, it sounded like a really, really simple setup. But believe me when I tell you, this show was cursed. Now, I am not a superstitious person. I am not the kind of person who, I appreciate little theater traditions like, the theater ghost or, never say Macbeth while you're standing on stage or your production's going to be cursed and you got to run outside and turn around and spit over your shoulder, That's all fun and games, but I don't take any stock into it. I'm the kind of person who believes that if you're a professional and you know your job and you're trained to do what you do, then curses are things that people make happen, Still, believe me when I tell you this show was cursed. Everything that could possibly go wrong tended to go wrong with this show. Now, it could be that it was a touring production as well as a stage show. We did about a month and a half run, as I recall, on the stage, and then we took it on tour, and we toured for a solid year with this show. And when you're doing something for that long, of course things are not always going to go according to plan. This was such an understatement with this thing, though. And usually it was something involving costume flubs. With that many quick changes, things tended to happen. I remember right off the bat, the first one was with the rabbit costume, of course, because early on in the production, we had to get things done pretty hastily, and the costumes weren't entirely finished before we started putting these things up in front of an audience. And I just so happened to have the fastest costume change in the show. And when I say it was the fastest in the show, that's underselling the fact that this was the fastest costume change I have ever had in my life. And, this was early on in my professional, at least post-college career, but to this day, I have never had a costume change that was faster than this. I'll give you an idea. In the opening scene, I'm there as Christopher Robin talking with Pooh and Piglet, and I exit stage left, and I say the line, "Well, I'll see you later, Pooh. I gotta go do my homework." And I exit stage left around the backdrop, which is, that's the stage left exit. You just turn the corner around the wall that we had constructed. There was one line of dialogue that consisted of one sentence spoken by Pooh, and then I had to enter stage right on the other side of the set, dressed as the rabbit. So in order to pull this off, we had to have our stage manager standing backstage holding this costume open for me. It was just a big, huge onesie that, had Velcro up the back. Might have been a zipper. I don't remember. But I would say, "Okay, Pooh, I gotta do my homework." And I'd exit backstage. I would run across the back of the stage, jump into this thing with both feet. She'd zip the back of the thing up, throw on my hood with my rabbit ears, and I would walk onto the stage dressed as Rabbit. Well, in the early days of this production, they had a problem with this not really being a onesie. There were gloves for rabbit hands and feet that I had to slip on over my shoes. And it was really kind of impractical. It took too much time. So they realized they were going to have to sew all of these things on, and I was just going to have to dive into this thing, and we would really have to practice this and get it down to a science. But unfortunately, the sewing had not been done yet. So the costumer, their solution was to simply safety pin everything on. Well, great. It was secure. It wasn't going anywhere. The problem with safety pins, however, is that if you apply enough force at the spot where they're pinned, they're gonna come undone. And that happened one day. I said my line, "Well, see you later, Pooh. I gotta go do my homework." I rounded the stage corner. I bolted backstage. I dove into this thing. And when I landed, one of the feet came loose and one of the safety pins came undone. But I didn't realize this because I was so focused on getting out on stage. And I made it in perfect time. I did the whole scene as Rabbit. Now, to give you an idea of what the Rabbit was like in this production, Rabbit was kind of, he's sort of the pontificator of the bunch. He's always the guy who's always thinking. But because there was no Tigger, Rabbit was kind of the wild, insane one that was sort of the foil to Eeyore, So I played the whole thing at extremely high energy. To give you an idea, the first interaction you see with Rabbit is Winnie the Pooh on stage saying, "Is that you, Rabbit?" And my response is, "Let's pretend it isn't and see what happens." And then I twist my ears around and make faces and start going, "Blah, blah, blah," which is utterly stupid, and the children absolutely loved it. But because I'm so crazy, I'm running around the stage, I'm making faces, and I get through this whole scene. Well, just as I'm about to exit, and Rabbit's exit is very much at that same high energy, I run off stage going, "Blah, blah, blah, blah." Well, it just so happens that as I said my last line and turned to make my exit, the safety pin that had come undone when I popped it by jumping into the costume had somehow worked its way under my foot. And when I took that last step to go off stage, the safety pin drove into the center of my foot. Now, I had to take my shoes off to get into this thing. I just had slip-on shoes for Christopher Robin, so that was like the first thing I did when I got off as Christopher Robin, is I jump out of the shoes and then jump into the Rabbit. It was just a whole lot easier that way. So there was no protection. This safety pin just drove straight into the center of my foot about halfway. And so I couldn't put any more weight on it. When I felt that pain, I lifted my foot off the ground, but I also had to get off stage, so I effectively just dove backstage behind the big backdrop. So what the kids saw was, "See you later, Pooh," dive, and I'm gone. And I pulled the safety pin out of my foot, and we kept going. If only the curse was that simple. Oh, no, dear friends, it got so much worse. Now, again, mostly it was just costume failures. I remember we did a performance at the National Zoo. They have a theater there, an indoor theater at the National Zoo, and we performed Winnie the Pooh there for like 500 kids or something. It was a pretty big crowd of kids, and this was also in the early days when the hood of the Rabbit outfit was held on around the neck by just a couple of flimsy pieces of Velcro. And when I did out my first entrance, they said, "Hey, Rabbit, is that you?" And I went, "Let's pretend it isn't and see what happens." Blah! And I emoted so strong that the Velcro straps just popped and the whole hood just flew open right at the neck. And me being, the consummate professional that I am, immediately said to myself in my head, "Whoa, I have to, there's no way to cover this. I have to react in character. What would happen if my throat just popped open?" So I just started choking on stage. And then I looked up and realized that, there were 500 ashen-faced, traumatized little children watching me. And so I just quietly redid the Velcro and went on with the scene. But, costume problems aside, there were many other issues. I remember my good friend Strawberry, who we all knew her as Strawberry. Her name is Christine. I'm sure she wouldn't mind me telling that. But she's the one who got me the job in this wonderful production to begin with. She was there in the show as well, and she played a multitude of characters. She was playing Piglet. She played Baby Roo. I believe she was the owl. And, she was like the cast of thousands in this thing. And she had so many rapid fire changes that every now and then she would forget what character she was playing. And, sometimes Owl would pick up Piglet's stutter, which I found absolutely hilarious. But, "Oh, hello, Pooh. I mean, Pooh." It was just utterly ridiculous. But perhaps the worst moment of not saying your line properly, well, that was a distinction that also went to me. Now this particular performance, I think, was a true nightmare gig, and it would have been without what happened, because we were hired to go do effectively a street festival to perform this show in sort of a street festival setting. But it wasn't an actual street festival. It was inside a mall in Virginia. It was a giant indoor shopping mall. And they had closed it down one night, and at every little corner of this thing, there was some performance going on. It was like a big, huge cultural street festival kind of thing that was being held indoors. So there were performance spaces everywhere. Like every anchor store had something going on in front of it. Every little corner that you could turn had another stage set up where things were going on. And we were at one end of it. And because we had, it was a big mall and it was a large echoey space and it was really not meant for performing, we had to be mic'd, because not only were we competing with all of the other shows that were going on, but there were thousands of people in this place, and, all of their voices and footsteps were just echoing around us. And on top of that, they didn't turn off the music that was being piped through this shopping mall 24/7. They just left it on. So we were competing with all of that, and so they had to put microphones on us. Now, we never performed this thing with microphones before, but they had their own sound tech guy, and he said, no, we can mic you up. It'll be no problem. I don't know why this guy's like talking like this all of a sudden, but in my head, this is someone who, and I love going to new venues where you have to use their stuff, and they always insist that their guy is the person who hooks you up with everything and runs all the stuff, because they're the ones who are most familiar with the tech. The problem is they're never familiar at all with the show that you're doing. So it's never a smooth transition. Well, we explained, we've got some fast costume changes, and so we have to have these mics that are going to be kind of unobtrusive, and they're not going to get in the way of the costumes. It's no problem. Hands us these gigantic headset mics. Like huge, over-the-head, they're like headphones without the earpieces, and they've got this enormous Vox mic on a big black arm that extends around your face and has this huge puffball in front of you. It's like we're Britney Spears performing in animal costumes from the 100 Acre Wood. It's utterly ridiculous looking. Well, I had the additional problem of having to wear this as Christopher Robin and then somehow not get it completely mangled when I jumped into the rabbit outfit. I had this new thing to worry about where I had to stick my head through the hood of this thing while I'm jumping in without tearing this mic off my face. Well, we practiced it a few times, and I got it down pretty good. And the problem with having a tech guy running the microphones, is they'll say, well, we don't want this thing on all the time. It's like, no problem. I'll just turn them on and off when you enter and exit the stage. And immediately I'm thinking, no, that's not going to work because, one, you don't know exactly when our entrances and exits are, so you can't anticipate it. There's sometimes, that people have to say lines from backstage. So we said, all right, why don't you just let us do it? And he said, well, there's a mute button here on the side. You can just turn them on and off. I was like, okay, I can do that. No problem. Well, it was a problem. Now, I should point out that this whole thing was witnessed by a friend of mine by the name of Max, who just so happened to be the understudy for the show. The guy playing Winnie the Pooh was scheduled to leave the production. We'd been doing it for a while at this point, and he was making a move to New York to go off and be famous in New York. And, I have to admit, I've seen him in a couple of little commercials and things like that. I believe he might have become the referee for the Puppy Bowl every year. But anyway, Max was the understudy, and he was getting ready to take over the role of Winnie the Pooh. So he was there watching. He was watching the performance so he could sort of, shadow his character from a distance and get a feel for what the show, the flow of the show was. So he was up in the balcony of this 2-story shopping mall watching us. Behind him on the floor, like the next stage over, where it was like an African drumming troupe. And so we were really being drowned out by everything. So they pumped the microphones up pretty high. And, it wasn't quite like in the stadium where you hear your voice echoing out, but it was close. It's like, hi, Pooh, Pooh, Pooh. But when we got to the point of my very first exit, where that costume change happens, where I have to walk off stage as Christopher Robin and jump into the rabbit outfit and come back on, that's where everything went wrong. I walked out on stage, did my part as Christopher Robin, The mic sounded just fine. Everything was working. I said, okay, Pooh, I gotta go do my homework. And I rounded the backdrop and switched off the microphone because you had to. Otherwise, on stage, they would have heard the muffled noises of my jumping into this costume. They would have heard, oh, okay, I gotta go do my homework. It would have been terrible. Take my word for it. So I muted the mic, jumped into the rabbit outfit. Stage manager zipped it up the back. Everything was sewed at this point, so it was just a giant rabbit onesie. I got the microphone through the hood, leaned down, switched on the microphone, and nothing happened. The light didn't come on. I couldn't hear anything through the microphone. I kind of breathed through it a little. I gave it a little tap. There was nothing. And I was like, oh crap, what do I do? You know, in my head, I didn't make the connection that even though we had told the sound tech guy not to turn the mics on and off as we were entering and exiting, that's probably what he did anyway. He just ignored what we told him. So he had probably turned my mic off. Well, the problem is Rabbit has to start, bleh, from backstage, which is what prompts Pooh's first line of, hey, is that you, Rabbit? So when I turned this microphone on and nothing happened, I panicked. I didn't want to go out because I had to figure out what was wrong with the mic. My mind wasn't thinking this isn't my problem. But I knew that if I went out there, even screaming as loud as I did as Rabbit, no one was gonna hear me because there was so much noise in this place. And in the meantime, I hear the cue line on stage come and go. And this is really frustrating because I had just done this costume change in record time. I had never done it faster, even with the microphone on. And the stage manager at this point is like looking at me like, what's going on? And I just kind of mouthed the words like, the microphone isn't working. And she's like, what's the problem? And I said, the microphone, I can't get, and now on stage, I hear them vamping. I hear them, they're improvising lines to try and cover the fact that I'm not out there. And, the stage manager's like, she's shrugging at me. She doesn't know what to do. And finally I just went, well, shit, and that's when the microphone kicked back on. Throughout the entire mall, full of several thousand people, I hear my amplified voice going, well, shit. Yeah. Now on stage, the next improvised line I hear is from my friend Strawberry playing Piglet, who says, and I quote, sounds like Rabbit's coming. Never liked that Rabbit. But what can you do? I just walked out on stage and did the part, and we got through the rest of the show without incident. And it seemed to me like nobody reacted. That was the weirdest thing. Like nobody said anything. Now, obviously, Pooh and Piglet figured it out pretty quick, and the stage manager was right there. But it didn't seem like anything had happened. So the show finished, and I'm sitting backstage on the edge of our little platform with my hood off, just a man in a giant furry outfit. And Max, the understudy, comes walking up to me. And he kind of walks into my line of sight and stands there for a minute. And I look up and we lock eyes, and he just says, you foul-mouthed rabbit. And I was just crushed. I was like, oh God, was it bad? Did everybody react? And he said he watched the audience, and this is a real study, a psychological study in the disconnect that people can have. He said he watched everybody in the audience. He said like half the parents' heads kind of turned and looked at each other with this expression of, did I just hear? Nah. Because that couldn't have actually just happened, right? There's no way. So somehow I dodged a bullet there. And, Max was the only one who really wouldn't, let me off the hook for that. But, oh, poor Max should not have been so judgmental right off the bat, because little did he realize that the absolute worst thing that could happen in this show was about to happen to him. A few weeks later, just a couple short weeks later, our original Winnie the Pooh left, and it was Max's turn to come take over the role. Now, we'd rehearsed with him a lot. He was ready. He was totally down. It was totally smooth. He had it. And his first show was coming up. Now, his first performance as Winnie the Pooh was going to be for a first night festival. This is a New Year's Eve party, essentially. It was at the Silver Spring Armory in Silver Spring, Maryland, a place that no longer exists. Silver Spring still exists. The Armory is no longer there. But this was going to be a big, huge event with like 500 kids and all of their families in this room. and the news crews were going to be there. They were going to be filming to put us on the news later that night to say, hey, look what happened at the first night festival today. So this was a day performance. We went out there and we set up our crappy little set with our backdrop and our fake wooden tree and our fake coffee can stump with a sandbag in it and our paper mache boulder. And we started doing the show. And Max was doing great. He was doing awesome. The kids were eating it up. They loved it. Well, things were fine until the very climax of the show. Now, I don't know how familiar any of you are with the typical Winnie the Pooh story, but generally there's hijinks ensuing, and in this particular instance, it was a case where Winnie the Pooh was tasked with guarding this honey jar, but of course, him being Winnie the Pooh, he just can't help himself. And he says, oh, maybe I'll just try a little smackerel, and eats a little bit of honey, and then, he eats a little bit more. And ultimately, he ends up getting the honey jar stuck on his head because he stuck his whole head in this thing to lick it clean. And then he can't get it off, and he's roaming around the forest with a honey jar on his head going, which is terrifying to Piglet, who then mistakes him for a heffalump. It's a typical climax to that type of story. Well, in order to portray this honey jar, whoever it was that made our props, I don't know who that was, but they created the honey jar by taking another one of those gigantic coffee cans, these metal, these tin coffee cans, and painting it like a honey jar. But in order for this to work, they cut eye holes in it. They cut this long rectangular slit in it, so that we could line that up with the actor's eyes so they could see out of it. And to cover that, they just covered it with this amber piece of lighting gel that sort of matched the paint so that it looked like it was seamless. It was pretty obvious that the guy looked like this old 1950s sci-fi robot with the thing on. But, it fit over the big Winnie the Pooh furry head with the big bear ears and everything, and they could see through it and it was fine. And that was how it worked. Well, for some reason, at this particular performance, something went wrong with his costume change. He was back there for a little while, and the stage manager who was there helping him, well, things got into a little bit of a kerfuffle. Now, what's happening on stage at this point is that I have changed back into Christopher Robin, and Piglet is there in a panic, going, oh, Christopher Robin, something terrible has happened. There's a heffalump in the forest. And, and I'm like, what? And, well, backstage, we had no idea what was going on. We found this out later, but Pooh was having some issues with his costume, and his cue came and went, and he wasn't ready to go out, and he apparently didn't hear it. So the stage manager, being helpful, said, oh my God, you're on, and grabbed the honey pot, the big tin can honey jar, and shoved it onto his head and pushed him out in the direction of the stage. Well, unfortunately, they were in such a panic to get this done that she didn't line the eye holes up correctly, and it went onto his head kind of askew. Now, normally, there's just enough space. The eye slit was just big enough, for both of his eyes to look out. But when it was sideways, apparently the edge of this thing went right down the middle of his left eye, and it was off to the side of his head. So he could see out of exactly half of one eye. And it was through a lighting gel and some fur that was in his peripheral vision. So in other words, he couldn't see at all. And he just stumbled out around the backdrop, and he's supposed to be going, it makes Piglet think he's a heffalump, but really he's just, crazy because he's got a honey jar stuck on his head. Well, because he couldn't see, the first thing that happened is he walked straight into the giant wooden tree that we had. Now, the tree was it was a flat piece of plywood that was cut out in the shape of a tree. It was even taller than the backdrop, and it was sort of angled so that it was flat up against the backdrop, but slightly off to the side. It had a hole cut out in the front so Owl could stick her head out, and, it was anchored in place by another big sandbag. But he just pounded into this thing and clipped it on the way by, and of course it starts crashing to the ground. And as it goes, one of the big, huge wooden branches just so happened to catch a corner of the backdrop, which was just a huge piece of painted muslin attached to a PVC frame. And as this branch caught the muslin, it peeled the backdrop away from the frame. And so and I remember being on stage and seeing this enormous part of the set just come down, and the tree comes crashing to the ground, and you hear this ripping noise. The muslin is, and half of the backstage is instantly exposed. I see this stage manager suddenly completely exposed to the audience freak out and dive behind the muslin to get out of sight. And in the meantime, Max, poor Max with this thing on his head, is now just like stumbling around the stage like, a bull missing legs. And he's bumping into things. And, Piglet and I are trying to stay in character this whole time. We're hiding behind the boulder, and I'm supposed to, as Christopher Robin, stand up and realize what's happening and see it's like, oh, that's just Pooh with a honey jar stuck on his head. Well, I leaped up. It's like, oh, this is just Pooh. And, I walked over there, and I'm supposed to rescue him from the honey jar, But when I got over there, I realized because this thing was put on his head sideways, that eye slit kind of locked around the big, furry bear ear of his hood for his costume. And it just locked into place. So, in other words, the honey jar really was stuck on his head. That thing was not coming off. So I just was supposed to gently lift it off, but I was like, ooh, that's locked into place. And so, my being the professional actor that I was, I did the only thing I could think of, and I just yanked on that thing with all of my might. And the ear came free from the from the eye slit. You hear this big, and the thing pops off of his head, and he was pulling so hard in the opposite direction to get back that when that thing came loose, he went off his feet. He just went ass over teacups, and like his feet went up above his head, and he went sailing backwards, and he landed full back with his head coming right down on the fake stump. Now again, this stump was just another one of those big tin coffee cans anchored with a sandbag inside of it, and a big, huge piece of plywood on top for, the top of the tree stump. He hit that thing with his head full force, and I swear to God, it split in two. Like the plywood went one way, the coffee can went the other. He just totally brained himself on this thing, and he's lying there full back. And I look down at him, and I can see his eyes spinning around in his head. And unfortunately, he's got the next line. He's supposed to stand up and go, "Oh, thank you so much, Christopher Robin. I don't know what I would have done if I couldn't get that honey jar off my head." But he slowly staggered to his feet, and I looked into his eyes, and I could tell there was no one home. I could see the stars spinning around his head. And like I said, his next line was, "Oh, thank you, Christopher Robin. I don't know what I would have done if I hadn't gotten that honey jar off my head." But what came out of his mouth as he looked around at the carnage on stage was, "Oh, Christopher Robin, I broke the forest." And I just kind of said, "That's okay, Pooh. I'll take care of it." And I went over and I lifted up the tree and I started putting the fabric back in place. And I put the stump back together. And it was all on the evening news later that night. Easily the most cursed show I had ever been in my life. You'll be happy to know that everyone survived it. Max did not have a concussion after that. He easily could have. I still have fond memories of that cast and of that show and of that being my first professional production right out of college. Even the days where I was up at 6 a.m. driving the big, huge van with the set and the rest of the cast in the back dressed as a 5.5-foot tall rabbit. I can imagine it too. I don't think I ever actually drove in costume, but in my head, I can see me behind the wheel of this van with 5 o'clock shadow all over my face and bags under my eyes. If I had had a cigarette, I would have hung that on my lips too. So I could pull up at a light dressed as a big rabbit and see somebody staring and just go, "What? You never seen a rabbit driving a van before?" It was a great show. It was definitely cursed. And it definitely had more than its fair share of nightmare gigs. This has been Steve Wannall. Thanks for listening. Peace.